There was an all too familiar ding as the fifth bullet to strike Nathaniel today ricocheted off his armor, falling onto the broken concrete beside him. He knew it was too good to be true. Making it all the way from Concord to Diamond City without running into any trouble was never going to happen. He was hunched in his faded black Enclave armor behind a pile of crudely stacked sandbags, waiting for the raiders across the street to pause and reload their rifles. With a groan, Nathaniel reached into his pack and withdrew a plasma grenade. He glanced over the cover to the abandoned shop and saw the window two of his attackers were firing from. He pressed the button, causing the grenade to hum and light up a radiant green before reeling back and launching it in their direction. The pulsating projectile arced over wrecked cars in the road and descended directly into the window, shattering what remained of the glass and triggering a cry of panic from the raiders. Nathaniel counted down from 3 before vaulting over the sandbags and charging headlong across the street. As he did so, the room erupted in an explosion of green chaos, covering his charge. The raiders not killed in the blast shielded their eyes from the blinding light, and Nathaniel perked up his rifle, taking aim at the stunned foes. With uncanny precision, he fired at one, dissolving the raider into a pile of ash. He slid behind a car and caught the next in his sights. He squeezed the trigger again, decapitating the raider where he stood. Nathaniel had only counted 5 hostiles, but where was the last one? That thought was interrupted by the guttural cry of a shirtless raider sprinting in his direction. The raider closed the distance quickly, raising his spiked bat to swing down on him, but Nathaniel was on his feet, ready to confront the impact. The bat came down hard. Nathaniel caught the raider's arm just before the hit landed. He twisted his closed fist, splintering the raider's wrist and wrenching the bat from his grasp. Instinctively, Nathaniel crashed his helmeted head into the face of the assailant, killing him instantly. The street was suddenly silent again. Nathaniel inspected his armor for damage and sighed when he noticed a dent on his chest plate. He holstered his plasma rifle and continued on his way to Diamond City. The stadium had just come into sight on the southern horizon. Nathaniel descended the staircase into Diamond City just as the daylight turned to dusk. The former baseball stadium was painted in an orange hue, and the rusted sheet metal shanties scattered around the city seemed to reflect every beam straight into his visor. Nathaniel nodded politely to the onlookers. They'd probably never seen a suit of armor like his in their lives. Rather than terrifying the locals, he decided to remove his helmet. The hot days traveling and fighting had taken its toll on Nathaniel more than he had noticed. The formidable face of the Enclave helm was betrayed by the fatigue and weariness apparent on the face of the man underneath. His dark graying hair was slicked to his temples and deep bags lined the undersides of his eyes. The feeling of the cool evening breeze was enough to give Nathaniel some solace. He took some time to stock up on equipment and make some repairs to his battered armor before following the makeshift signposts to the Dugout Inn. A good night's sleep was something Nathaniel truly craved. The inn had a quaint feel to it. It was nothing fancy. The chairs were uncomfortable, the walls were bare, cracking in places, and the regulars lingered over their beers, keeping to themselves. Nathaniel took a seat at the bar and removed his helmet, placing it at his feet with his bag of supplies. "Hello, my friend." The cheerfulness in the bartender's voice was jarring against the somber mood of the inn. "My name is Vadim Bobrov. What are you drinking?" "What would you recommend?" Nathaniel replied, trying unsuccessfully to match some of the enthusiasm. "Well, if you want beer, we have ice-cold Gwyneth, or whiskey if that's more to your taste. But I'd recommend the Dugout Inn's very own creation, Bobrov's Best Moonshine." Vadim revealed a bottle with a clumsily drawn label. It looked like he'd pulled it straight out of the bin. Nathaniel replied, "Why the hell not? I'll have a glass." "That's the spirit, my friend." The bartender poured the slightly murky concoction in Nathaniel's glass and then went back to polishing the countertop. Nathaniel took a sip and tried to hold back a cough. It was a foul-tasting drink, but it did the job. For a while, he sat quietly, watching the patrons come and go, occasionally listening to see if anything noteworthy was happening in Boston these days. After draining his second glass of moonshine, Nathaniel's head had begun to swim. It was about time to call it a night. That thought, though, was cut short as a mysterious man took a seat on the stool beside him. "I couldn't help but notice your armor. Haven't seen one of these pretties in a good 4 or 5 years. You one of those Hail President Eden types?" the stranger asked. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "The name's Chet." Chet didn't look like much. Fairly average build, unremarkable face, short messy hair, long sideburns, and bushy eyebrows crowning his dark brown eyes. While mostly forgettable, he had a somewhat unhinged vibe about him. I'm going to be upfront with you. You look like the kind of guy who has his shit packed in. You can handle a fight. Me and my boys are on a job and we could use a knight in shining armor to come save the day. Nathaniel cut to the chase. How much? Oh yes, we got a keen little knight. The noble reward for the noble deed largely depends on how much of a gallant warrior you can be. Nathaniel firmly repeats himself. How much? Ah, serious man. Well, my good sir, it's 1,200 caps split 5 ways at the moment. 6 ways if you come along, but I can guarantee we will lose 1 or 2 of mine. Billy's a bit of a fucktard, can't keep his head down, you see. I'm sure he'll get iced. That's a lot of caps. What's the job exactly? Nathaniel asked. Some settlers are having a problem with raids and attacks on their crops, but they don't have the firepower or balls to sort it out themselves. That's where me and a few guys come in. You too, if you're interested. Come meet me outside the city gates tomorrow at sunrise. Dost thou accept thy quest? Chet asks in his elated demeanor. Yeah, I'll be there, Nathaniel said. Chet looked over both shoulders and then stood up. He was dressed in road leathers and had a sawn-off shotgun hitched to his belt. He seems like the kind of guy who doesn't appreciate being stood up. He waited for Chet to leave and then put a handful of caps on the table before heading off to find his room for the night. Nathaniel woke as the dawn's light entered the window of his room. The curtains were drawn, but they were riddled with holes, and conveniently a beam of light had penetrated the curtains' meager defenses. The sunlight revealed just how badly this place needed cleaning. The barren room was speckled with dust, and the rays of light penetrating into the room painted them in a bright white glow. Nathaniel stretched his arms over his head, noticing multiple clicks and cracks his limbs made in protest. His head was sore, but it was nothing he wasn't used to. He climbed back into the power armor and made his way from the inn. There was little movement in the city besides the odd market stall preparing for the day's business. Nathaniel made his way to the front gates, nodding to the guards on duty. Congregated by the statue of a once pre-war baseball player stood a group of mercenaries. From experience, Nathaniel could tell this lot were a lot more interested in appearing intimidating than professional. He walked over to join the man named Chet who was briefing the other mercs. Ah, Chet said. Our knight has arrived. With the extra manpower, we should be able to clear the greens out in no time. The mercenaries turned to face Nathaniel. His face was covered by the daunting visage of his Enclave helmet, and their aggressive expressions seemed to falter at the sight of him. We are fighting super mutants? Nathaniel asked. Yeah, one of the mercs said, a look of distrust clear on his face. Nathaniel's immediate instinct was this guy was trouble. There's a settlement that keeps getting hit. The 5 of us were going to go deal with it, but now I'm hearing we have a 6th person to split the reward with. Oh, shut up, Mason. Shiny Suit here has more equipment than the rest of us combined, and I'd rather be alive than have a few extra caps, Chet said. The mercenaries began to walk north around the side of Diamond City. Nathaniel followed, taking the chance to get a proper read of his temporary companions. They were all well equipped with relatively well-kept guns, but none of them looked combat trained. These were typical opportunists, born in some hovel somewhere, resorting to violence as a means to get by. During his time in the Enclave, Nathaniel had dealt with people just like this countless times, always cocksure and full of pride, but they fell just as quickly when the pure-blooded Enclave soldiers turned their rifles on them. The hike took most of the day. By the time Chet signaled that the settlement was nearby, the sun was descending in the west. The settlement was a small town. There was only about 20 buildings as far as Nathaniel could tell, but the majority of it seemed to be abandoned. They soon encountered a small camp where the settlers waited, hidden behind the largest building in the settlement. Obviously, they'd moved their people and their valuables to one place in order to make it easier to fend off attackers. They were wise to set up camp out of sight, but Nathaniel couldn't help but notice one of the settlers gathering firewood. If one thing was guaranteed to attract unwanted attention, it was smoke. His attention was soon diverted as he saw Chet, Mason, and the other 3 mercs engaging in a heated exchange with the scared settlers. He went over to hear what was going on. You promised us twice this sum, Chet said. This is all we have. We will pay, we just need our settlement safe so we can start producing the crops again. Nathaniel could feel it. This was not going to end well. After we came all this way, Chet said as he shook his head. Mason was pacing around the settlers, his eyes locked on a young teenage girl amongst them. Now what you've done here is lie, and nobody likes a liar. Lying is a crime, punishable by death where I'm from. The adult settlers began to plead in desperation. But you aren't where I'm from, so I'll be lenient. Nathaniel tried to keep his calm, tried to just do the damn job. Chet signaled his men. "All right, boys, we got a pack of liars. Take what you want and let's get out of this shithole." "I want the girl," Mason uttered through a sickly grin. He grabbed the girl by the arm, ignoring the violent sobs convulsing her body. Mason turned back to look at the other mercs, but was met by Nathaniel's gauntleted fist as it obliterated his skull. Mason's head ripped clean off and a shower of broken teeth and blood sprayed across the ground. His grip of the girl loosened as his body fell. Nathaniel hadn't been thinking. Rationality had disappeared from his mind the moment he saw the tears well in the girl's eyes. Not again, he thought. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what the fuck just happened here?" Chet yelled. "Have you lost your fucking mind, Tin Man? Does he look like a fucking green super mutant to you? What are you doing?" Nathaniel turned to Chet, staring him straight in the eyes through the eyes of his Enclave helmet. Just being a noble knight. The mercenaries attacked all at once, but their cheap guns were no match for his armor. He pulled out his plasma rifle with his left hand and began firing at the three onlooking mercs. Nathaniel gripped Chet by the throat, lifting him clear off the ground. Chet scratched at Nathaniel's armored hand to no avail, and the veins in his forehead bulged from the overwhelming pressure. Chet gurgled and choked and eventually went limp in Nathaniel's grasp. He dropped the merc and placed his now empty hand on the stock of his gun. The remaining mercs were accurate, but their weapons were no match for his armor, and he effortlessly picked each of them off with his plasma rifle. Nathaniel sat alone at the campfire. He had stacked the bodies of the mercs out of sight in the vain hope that he hadn't scared the settlers too much. But as he expected, they continued to keep their distance. In the light of the campfire, Nathaniel removed his helmet. The stress of killing more men was evident on his face. Deep wrinkles lined his cheeks and forehead, and despite the good night's sleep, the heavy bags were back under his eyes. He noticed at the corner of his eyes a settler coming over to the campfire. It was the young girl he'd saved. She couldn't have been older than 13. She sat down at the warmth of the fire, only a few hand lengths away from Nathaniel. He had expected her, of all people, to be frightened, but the girl had a naive bravery about her. "Thank you," the girl muttered. "I brought you some sugar bombs. I already ate half, and they're a little bit strange tasting." The girl stretched her arm out with the sugar box in hand. Nathaniel slowly took the box as to not accidentally startle the girl. "What's your name, girl?" he asked. "I'm Amy O'Connell," she replied with a pleased look on her lightly freckled face. "What's your name?" Her piercing blue eyes cut straight through Nathaniel's gruff and hardy exterior. He sat there contemplating the girl's uncanny comfort in sitting only inches away from the man who just butchered a whole gang of mercenaries. "Nathaniel, my name is Nathaniel Grayson," he replied slowly. The two began chatting for a while, Nathaniel sharing his less gruesome stories and Amy sharing her stories of an exaggerated nature. As the night progressed and the cold closed in, the other settlers slowly joined them at the campfire. The settlers exchanged glances and then a man spoke up. "Your associates weren't pleased because we were 400 caps short, but if you can do this alone, you're welcome to the full 800 cap reward." "I'm sorry. At sunrise I'm leaving, and I suggest you do too. Fighting a whole force of super mutants isn't worth 800 caps, let alone the life it would probably cost me." As much as Nathaniel wanted to help, he was a practical, rational man. The settlers began to leave for bed. Amy was holding a man's hand, being ushered to bed as she was looking back at Nathaniel, with a look that would give him a hard night's rest. A look that sadly accepts the shitty reality that was dealt to her. One of the settlers thanked Nathaniel for dealing with the mercenaries and wished him good night. As Nathaniel laid down his head, he would have everything but a good night's rest. Nathaniel woke suddenly to the sounds of screams. It was still dark, the only source of light coming from the campfire which shied under the wind and rain of an oncoming radstorm. Nathaniel swept up his helmet, placing it firmly over his head, and then grabbed his rifle. It began to vibrate softly as the plasma powered up. This was the familiar buzz of battle. The settlers had taken shelter in the hollow atrium of the large building, and Nathaniel was left alone in the middle of the street with little to no cover. He saw super mutants charging to his position. Only super mutants disregarded subtlety in this way. They had him surrounded, and he should be dead, but their carelessness and lack of finesse would be his only chance to capitalize. Pipe rifle rounds clanked against his armor, fired by several super mutants who bellowed their war cries. Nathaniel directed his fire at them, ignoring the half a dozen super mutants bounding towards him with sledgehammers and baseball bats. He had a moment's respite from them and he had to use it wisely. He took aim and fired. The glow of plasma cast a green light over his surroundings, overpowering the fading fire. He didn't see them go down, but he heard their cries. The bullets stopped flying at him. The hammer-wielding mutant was closing in on him. He rushed to eject his empty cartridge, fiddling with his belt to find the replacement before his foe could get within striking distance. It was too late, Nathaniel realized. The super mutant raised his sledgehammer and swung down on Nathaniel. He dropped his plasma rifle and met the blow with a raised hand. He crushed the attacker's wrist with his steel-reinforced hand, writhing the sledgehammer free. The super mutant was defenseless now and was finally seeing the outcome of his rash actions, and his allies weren't close enough to intervene. Nathaniel swept the legs out from under the super mutant with a devastating kick, and the mutant fell clumsily to the floor. Without a moment's hesitation, he raised his boot and slammed it down, obliterating its skull against the concrete. The other mutants wised up. The 5 of them attacked in unison with a variety of makeshift deadly melee weapons. Nathaniel fended off as many blows as he could, ducking in and out of strikes, attempting to get within arm's reach of them one by one. He managed to juke a swipe from a nail-encrusted bat, but as he raised his fist to punch the wielder, a strong blow took him in the arm. Nathaniel was filled with dread when he felt his right arm go limp. The blow hadn't penetrated his skin, but the shoulder joint of his right pauldron had completely locked up. In a panicked bout of rage, Nathaniel gripped his broken arm piece with his good fist and with a roar ripped it from his suit. He pulled the entire right arm off, freeing up his human arm underneath. He used this now free right hand to unbuckle the knife from his belt, and in one motion he continued to strike the mutant in front of him. He lodged the knife deep in the creature's chest. The other attackers didn't falter in capitalizing on Nathaniel's newly emerged weak spot. Before a targeted attack could come his way, he spun around and charged headlong into the first mutant he saw. They toppled to the ground with an earth-shattering thud. Nathaniel instinctively rolled on top of his foe and used his gauntleted arm to beat the super mutant's face repeatedly. He didn't stop until fragments of bone and teeth gave way under his might. Nathaniel could see the settlers running for their lives in the distance. Before he got back to his feet, he noticed his rifle lying on the ground beside him. He dove for it, loading a new cartridge while rolling onto his back. He shot frantically at the 3 remaining attackers, and he hit 2 of them between the eyes. The last one, bigger than the rest by at least a foot and armed with a giant rebar club, evaded the fire, and before Nathaniel could react, the crude concrete head of the weapon caught him in the chest. Immense pain filled every inch of Nathaniel's body. Thankfully, the armor had taken most of the force. There was a huge dent in the chest plate where it had hit, but the blow had rattled his bones and he knew the feeling of broken ribs all too well. Nathaniel's strength was draining fast, and as the monstrous mutant raised his club for another swing, he wasn't sure he could do anything to get out of the way. He heard the sickening whoosh in the air as the club came down again. In desperation, Nathaniel threw up his left vambrace, catching the club just under the head. He held the strike at bay with all of his remaining energy. Despite catching the shaft of the weapon, the concrete head was mere inches away from his face. The mutant raised the weapon once again for the final swing, and Nathaniel knew this was his last opportunity. He sprung to his feet and wrapped his strong arm around his foe, locking them in place. Nathaniel hit the eject button on his armor with his free hand, and the fusion core fell from the back of his suit, beeping as it dropped to the floor. He raised a leg and brought it down hard on the super mutant's shin, shattering it entirely. The mutant screamed in agony, and Nathaniel let him fall forwards on top of the live fusion core. Limping and holding his chest, Nathaniel threw himself in the opposite direction. When he hit the ground, he covered his head with his gauntlet. The explosion was muffled by the super mutant, but the force of the blast sent chunks of viscera flying in every direction. With the danger averted, Nathaniel mustered the strength to get back to his feet. The dented breastplate was preventing him from breathing properly, so he climbed out of the suit. Without the steel frame, he found that he couldn't support his own weight, so he fell to his knees. He sucked in a mouthful of air, savoring its sweet taste before coughing violently. He was still alive, somehow.